How we met is a story that begins with me inexplicably acquiring a grown son. Walking down the street, I was rather bewildered when someone tightly hugged my leg and called me mom. I didn't even have a boyfriend, let alone a son. Looking down, I saw a cherubic little fellow with a delicate, fair round face. My heart melted, and maternal instincts instantly flooded over me. I ruffled his fluffy, slightly curly hair, crouched down, and asked in the gentlest voice I could muster. "Little one, where are your parents?" He pouted, trying hard to squeeze out a few tears, lost them. As I was deliberating whether to take this little darling to the police station, someone suddenly ran up to us. "Monty!" The man called out, his voice remarkably pleasant. I instinctively looked up, and my goodness, what a treasure of a man. Every angle of his face hit my aesthetic sweet spot. The man was impeccably dressed in a suit, tall and slender, standing out distinctly from the hurried passers-by on the street. But what a pity, such a quality man was already a father. I sighed inwardly and held the little boy's hand. "Is this your dad?" The boy shook his head. Blimey, so handsome and yet a kidnapper. Handsome or not, I was instantly on guard. I pulled the little one behind me and looked at the man sternly. "What's his name?" The man seemed to hesitate for a moment, then answered honestly, "Monty Caldwell." I turned to the cherubic little fellow behind me. "Your name is Monty Caldwell?" The little one nodded. "Didn't you say he wasn't your dad?" "That's right." The little one looked at me, blinking his eyes. "He's not my dad, he's my uncle." Then, the precocious little fellow made a point of emphasizing, "He's a single uncle, you know." Single uncle. These two words deeply stimulated my nerves. I nodded, then pinched the little one's chubby cheek. "It's a bit formal to call me Mom, darling." "How about Auntie?" The little one obliged, immediately chirping out a sweet auntie. I glanced at the man out of the corner of my eye and saw his handsome face full of resignation. "All right," he spoke, taking the little one's hand, then looked up at me. "Thank you for earlier." With that, he nodded at me and walked past, pulling the little one along. I originally hesitated about whether to call him back, but a glance at the time made me give up. Never mind, I was about to be late for work. Sighing, I pushed this fleeting romantic encounter to the back of my mind, cut through an alley as a shortcut, and jogged to the office. However, after waiting for 2 lifts in the ground floor lobby, I encountered 2 people. "Auntie!" The little one was particularly enthusiastic, calling out in his sweet voice as soon as he saw me, then running full tilt to throw himself into my arms. Then the young uncle also stopped in front of me. He was much taller than me, looking down as he spoke. "The child is young and doesn't know better, please don't mind him." "Of course not," I said, staring into his eyes, deliberately flirting. With such a handsome uncle, any girl would be happy to be called Auntie. 1 second, 2 seconds, I waited for his reaction, but he just lightly shifted his gaze, not saying a word in response. I awkwardly turned my head, looking elsewhere in embarrassment. Fortunately, the lift doors opened soon, and I squeezed in with my bag. The lifts in our building were always crowded, and the uncle-nephew pair couldn't get in. They stood quietly at the lift doors waiting for the next one. As the doors closed, I thought I saw the little one tug at his uncle's trouser leg and sigh in exasperation. "Uncle, you're hopeless when given a chance." Exiting the lift, I rushed to clock in, and thankfully, I was just 1 minute shy of being late. Perfect timing. Sitting at my desk, I found my mind full of the young uncle's handsome face. For some reason, thinking carefully, I felt like I'd seen him somewhere before. I started trying hard to remember where I might have seen him. At the office? At the shopping center? In the neighborhood? It didn't seem to be any of those places. Unable to figure it out, I stopped pondering, but I didn't expect to encounter him again half an hour later. Moreover, this time it was in the conference room, where we sat face to face. Of course, the little cherub was sitting beside him, puffing out his chubby cheeks and grinning at me. "Auntie, your future husband has come to bring you money." Carefully observing the expressions of the young uncle and our boss, I inwardly sighed. One really shouldn't joke about such things. Who could have imagined that the single young uncle was actually our company's big client? As I looked up, my eyes met those of my young uncle-in-law. Suddenly nervous, I remembered the name of this important client, Chester Caldwell. So he was Chester Caldwell. Why had this big shot specifically requested me to handle this order? Such a large contract made me, a newly hired nobody, tremble a bit. What intrigued me more was how this gentleman had managed to uncover my identity within half an hour, just because the little one had called me auntie twice. But my boss didn't give me time to ponder. He rubbed his chin, looking thoughtfully between the three of us, then smiled and said, "Mr. Caldwell, our Virginia here is new. If there's anything she doesn't do quite right, please don't take it to heart." Chester nodded casually. "It's fine. She's family." Family? I was stunned by those 3 words. Glancing around, I caught the little one resting his chin on his hand, watching me. When he saw me look over, he winked. Oh dear. With that eye contact, the little one simply stood up and walked over, plopping down beside me. He familiarly linked his arm through mine. "Auntie, I'm hungry." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, and could only explain in a low voice, "Darling, I was just joking earlier. You should call me Miss, not Auntie." I'd only switched to this company 2 months ago, with its high pay and good benefits. I couldn't let this unfounded connection ruin it. But the little one acted as if he hadn't heard, stubbornly clinging to my arm. Looking up at me with his chubby little face, he repeated, "Auntie, I want a burger." I looked to my boss for help, but this usually lecherous old man who often leered at me was now incredibly firm. "Virginia, take Mr. Caldwell and the young master for a meal. Put your current work aside for now. Your task is to take good care of Mr. Caldwell and the young master." The repeated young master made my heart race. Faced with this crisis, I set out with the 2 VIPs, one big, one small, clutching the huge sum my boss had given me. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't nervous. Earlier, when we'd met by chance on the street, I could still cheekily flirt with this man who fit my ideal type, since we were all strangers. However, now that he transformed into a big client, I didn't dare be too bold. I stood in front of the little one, positioning myself to shield him from the sun, and bent down to ask, "Young master, what would you like to eat?" I smiled, using my gentlest tone to ask him. "Hamburger." The little one blinked at me, then said softly, "I've wanted one for ages, but Uncle won't let me. He says they're unhygienic." With that, the young master simply pushed me forward. "Auntie, please ask Uncle for me. He'll agree if you do." Caught off guard, I was pushed right in front of Chester. This little one might be small, but he's quite strong. With no choice, I straightened up to face this important client. I gave an awkward smile. The speech I prepared vanished the moment I met his gaze. These were perhaps the most beautiful eyes I'd ever seen. My resolve weak, I was dazed for a long moment before coming to my senses. Actually, KFC is quite good. Why don't we? All right. Before I could finish, Chester nodded directly. He looked at me quietly, his deep eyes seeming to speak, "Would you like that?" I was surprised he asked me this way. Weighing my options, I tentatively said, "I do enjoy it." This was the truth. I don't know about other girls, but at least for me, I can never resist the temptation of fried chicken and burgers. He nodded, "Then let's go." He agreed so casually, without any airs. The little one was very well behaved, not showing any extravagant or wasteful tendencies, only ordering a few items he liked. Chester was even more easygoing. When asked what he wanted, he would only say, "Anything is fine." This left me in a bit of a predicament. In the end, it was Monty who tugged at my sleeve and said in a low voice, "Auntie, don't bother asking him. He's never had KFC before." I glanced quickly at Chester, only to see him frown slightly without speaking or denying it. Understanding, I nodded and ordered many more items on my phone. After all, it was the boss's money. It wasn't mealtime, so the restaurant wasn't too crowded, but we'd ordered so much food that it took a while before our number was called. I hurriedly stood up, but before I could go over, my wrist was grasped. I thought it was Monty, but to my surprise, it was his uncle. Seeing me look at him, Chester immediately let go, his expression neutral. "I'll go." With that, Chester quickly walked away. Chester soon returned with the trays, 2 trays piled high, with a staff member helping him carry them. "Let's eat." Chester was unpretentious, not saying much, but quite attentive. He inserted the straw into the Coke cup before handing it to me, and even squeezed out the ketchup for us. Very gentlemanly. He was my ideal type indeed. Unfortunately, while the little one was clever and perceptive, his uncle seemed oblivious to romance. After those 2 rebuffs this morning, I no longer harbored any fantasies about this wealthy benefactor. However, just as I took a bite of my burger, the little one dropped a bombshell. "Auntie, why don't you consider my uncle? If you win him over, forget this business deal, the whole company could be yours." I was caught off guard by the weight of those words, nearly choking on my drink. Almost instinctively, I glanced at Chester Caldwell. He showed no reaction, casually picking up a chip without even a sidelong glance in my direction. The ripples that had just stirred in my heart were quickly quelled by his nonchalant gesture. As the meal came to an end, I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking we could finally bid farewell to the 2 gentlemen. However, Monty Caldwell swiftly latched onto my arm. "Aunt Virginia, I'm too full. Can we walk around the shopping center?" The little one pleaded, his eyes blinking softly. I felt myself wavering. Looking up at Chester for approval, I saw his face remained impassive as he gave a slight nod. "Let's go," he said. He then gave my outfit a once-over, his brow furrowing slightly. "We'll buy you something new as well." Seeing his frown, I couldn't help but feel I'd been found wanting. Before I could even think to refuse, Monty was already pulling me away. Chester led us to his car. A Volkswagen Passat. I raised an eyebrow, secretly impressed. It seemed not all bosses were into flashy cars. Chester was clearly more down to earth. Trying to break the ice, I awkwardly attempted some small talk as we got in. "Mr. Caldwell, you're quite different from other nouveau riche bosses I've known. Even your car is so understated. My brother has a Passat too, but the interior isn't nearly as nice as yours." However, my attempt at flattery seemed to have the opposite effect, as the car fell silent. Chester caught my eye in the rearview mirror, and if I wasn't mistaken, there was a hint of amusement in his expression. At that moment, Monty tugged at my wrist and whispered, "Aunt Virginia, this isn't a Passat. It's a Phaeton." I looked around, touching the interior, only able to mask my embarrassment with an awkward laugh. In reality, my toes were curling with mortification. As the atmosphere grew increasingly uncomfortable, Chester's voice came from the front again, "If you like it, I'll change cars tomorrow." Struggling to follow his train of thought, I tentatively asked, "Change to what?" We happened to stop at a red light, and Chester caught my eye in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. "A Passat." I forced a smile. "Whatever you prefer." As if I had any say in the matter. Soon enough, this faux Passat pulled into the car park of a shopping center. I knew of this place but had never been inside. I'd heard the prices were eye-watering. I nervously calculated in my head, wondering if the transfers the boss had made would be enough to cover the little master's spending. Despite my mental preparation, half an hour later, I was still stunned. Firstly, because the items here were even more expensive than I'd imagined. And secondly, because I hadn't expected that these 2 were actually here to buy clothes for me. I was pushed into action, with 2 outfits Monty had chosen thrust into my hands, and several enthusiastic shop assistants ushering me into a changing room. Inside, I snuck a peek at the price tag. Terrifying. This unremarkable-looking dress cost nearly a year's salary. In the changing room, I gingerly put on the clothes, terrified of accidentally tearing the seemingly delicate fabric. After changing, I took a deep breath, slowly opened the door, and stepped out. Feeling self-conscious in such expensive attire, I carefully tugged at the hem of the dress and timidly asked, "How does it look?" As I spoke, both Chester and Monty looked up. For a moment, I thought I saw a spark in both their eyes. Chester cupped his chin with one hand, his fingertips lightly brushing against his skin. The light in his eyes was fleeting, quickly fading away. After a moment of silence, he glanced at the shop assistant beside me and said in a low voice, "No need to try on anymore. We'll take all of them." Trembling with nerves, I found myself wearing a dress worth several months of my salary, while carrying bags of clothes that could easily cost me a year's income. I stepped out of the shop with these 2 benefactors, one tall and one small. It wasn't that I was playing hard to get, they simply didn't give me a chance to refuse. Whenever I tried to decline, Chester would threaten to have my boss fire me. The little one, though small in stature, was exceptionally clever. As we exited the shopping center, I couldn't hold back any longer. Biting my lip, I slowly asked him, "Mr. Caldwell, you haven't taken a fancy to me, have you?" Chester froze for 2 seconds, and then, if I wasn't mistaken, his ears gradually turned red. He then furrowed his brow, naturally taking the shopping bags from my hands, and said in a low voice, "Don't be silly." His casual words seemed to negate my previous question. I breathed a sigh of relief, yet felt an inexplicable sense of disappointment. Chester then drove me home. Monty, peering out of the car window, said something that made my heart skip a beat. "Bye, Auntie Virginia. We'll come see you again tomorrow." I responded with a forced smile, but inside I was terrified. Standing downstairs, I watched them drive away with my standard service smile, only relaxing once their car was out of sight. That night, I didn't sleep well. Looking at the clothes with tags still attached, I felt increasingly uneasy. Before bed, I folded the clothes and put them back in the shopping bags, planning to try and return them tomorrow and give the money back if possible. However, the next morning, I was awakened by the ringing of my phone. It was an unknown number. I've always had a bit of a temper when woken up, so I answered the phone rather grumpily. "Hello." There was silence for 2 seconds, then a pleasant and somewhat familiar voice came through, "We're waiting for you downstairs." I was stunned for a moment, unable to process the information. Who is this? Chester Caldwell. I rubbed my eyes as my brain slowly started to function. I suddenly sat up, glancing at the clock on the wall, and rushed to the window to look outside. Sure enough, there was that understated Volkswagen Passat parked below, with a tall man and a small boy standing beside it. I responded quickly, hung up the phone, and dashed to the bathroom. Wash up, change clothes, hastily apply some light makeup, then hurry downstairs. I thought that today we'd surely start discussing business. But no. As soon as I got downstairs, Monty flew into my arms, tugging at my hand, saying he wanted me to accompany him to the water park today. I'm guilty. Because my first thought was of Chester in swim trunks, his upper body bare. Before I could say anything, the little one spoke again. "Auntie Virginia, why are your ears red?" I snapped back to reality, self-consciously rubbing my ear, but denying it. "It's just from sleeping on it." I gradually realized that refusing was pointless with these two. Moreover, they were clearly prepared, with swimsuits and swim rings already in the car. I noticed that there seemed to be several women's swimsuits, and hesitantly asked in a low voice, "Is anyone else coming?" Chester glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "No, just the three of us." "Then these women's swimsuits." Monty jumped in to answer. "Auntie Virginia, you don't know, but my uncle has decision paralysis, and he wasn't sure what you'd like, so he bought several best-selling styles from the shop for you to choose from." I looked at the swimsuits in front of me, at least 6 or 7 sets. Rich people really are extravagant. On the way, with Monty being such a little entertainer, the atmosphere wasn't awkward at all, and we soon arrived at the water park. After changing into our swimwear, I came out to see the two of them standing by the door. One tall and one small, both exceptionally handsome, attracting quite a bit of attention. Once we got in the water, I belatedly realized, and couldn't help but glance at Chester's upper body. Chester's physique was far better than I had imagined. It wasn't just me looking at him, the girls passing by were all casting subtle glances his way. I have to say, after Chester got in the water, the number of girls in our area suddenly increased. Before long, the artificial waves started. Despite being prepared and clinging tightly to my swim ring, I was still caught off guard by a wave, my body flipping over and plunging into the water. Almost instinctively, I groped towards where Chester had been, and at the same time, a pair of hands firmly gripped my waist. Out of survival instinct, I reflexively hugged him, my legs tightly wrapped around his waist, as I suddenly emerged from the water. After coughing a couple of times, I realized something was amiss. The man I was clinging to with my legs was indeed Chester, but his body was incredibly stiff. At that moment, he was quietly looking at me, his usually impassive face now flushed red all the way to his ears. After a few seconds of eye contact, a trickle of red slowly seeped from under Chester's nose, winding its way down. "You." I stared at him in shock, unable to utter a word. As the waves subsided, the pool returned to calm. I instinctively reached out to wipe his face, but he turned away, avoiding my touch. "Mr. Caldwell, did I hit you?" I asked anxiously. Everything had happened so suddenly. I remembered a wave crashing over me, pushing me into someone before I was flipped over in the water. Had I accidentally struck his nose? Chester avoided my hand and looked away, his expression peculiar. "It's nothing," he muttered, hastily wiping his face before turning his gaze elsewhere. I didn't hesitate any longer. I grabbed Chester's wrist and pulled him out of the pool. Once on dry land, I suddenly remembered Monty. I hoped the little one was all right. I quickly turned to look for him, only to find the boy had already made it to shore. He was sitting nearby, wrapped in a towel, chatting away with a little girl about his age. Relieved, I hurried back to check on Chester's injury. The nosebleed that had seemingly stopped now began flowing again as I leaned in for a closer look. "Perhaps we should go to the first aid station," I suggested with a frown, moving my gaze from his bleeding nose to his face. That's when I noticed something rather startling. Chester's eyes seemed to be fixed on my chest. When he realized I had caught him looking, Chester hastily averted his gaze. He coughed awkwardly and turned towards the nearby rest area. I was left standing there, at a loss for words. Was he just going to walk away like that? It wasn't as if I had been the one staring at him. I hadn't even said anything yet. However, a few seconds later, Chester turned back. He was holding a towel, which he thrust into my hands. His voice was muffled as he said, "You should wrap this around yourself." I didn't quite understand at first. It took me a moment, but when I noticed Chester's reddened ears, it finally clicked. So, Chester's nosebleed wasn't from me bumping into him at all, but rather from being aroused by me? He touched the tip of his nose and glanced at me quickly, trying to maintain a stern expression. But his eyes betrayed his nervousness, his ears were bright red, and his breathing was rapid. There was no way he could fool me. My heart began to race as I watched his flustered state. 3 realizations dawned on me. 1. Chester might probably, perhaps have feelings for me. 2. This man was definitely a closet romantic. He might appear cold and indifferent on the surface, but in reality, just me hugging him in a swimsuit was enough to get him so excited he had a nosebleed. 3. I think I might have fallen for him too. Perhaps unable to bear the tense atmosphere any longer, Chester spoke up, leading me to the nearby rest area. Of course, to prevent this secretly passionate benefactor from having another nosebleed, I wrapped myself tightly in the towel. However, after the recent incident, I found it impossible to calm my emotions. In the end, I couldn't resist. While Chester was away buying drinks, I pulled Monty aside and quietly asked him, "Auntie has a question for you." "Okay," he responded obediently, blinking his eyes. "What is it, Aunt Virginia?" Before, when he called me aunt, I thought it was just innocent child speak. Now, hearing it made my heart flutter a bit. I cleared my throat and glanced in the direction Chester had gone before asking softly, "Your uncle, does he like me?" As soon as I asked, I regretted it. This little one was only 5 or 6 years old. How could he understand matters of the heart? To my surprise, the boy looked at me with astonishment. "He's being so obvious about it." "Do you really need to ask?" I hesitated for a moment, wanting to ask something more, but out of the corner of my eye I saw Chester returning with our drinks. I had to swallow my words. We continued our afternoon, eating, chatting, and enjoying the sunshine. Everything seemed normal. Chester didn't make any more ambiguous gestures, which was a relief to me. However, as we were preparing to leave, an unexpected incident occurred. I lost my bracelet. It wasn't a particularly expensive piece, but it held immense sentimental value for me. It was left to me by my grandmother when she passed away. She told me it had been passed down from her grandmother to her mother, and then to her. My mother died when I was young, so my grandmother had given the bracelet to me. This bracelet was the only heirloom my grandmother left me, and my sole tangible connection to her memory. So when I realized the bracelet was missing, I panicked. I had no recollection of when or where I might have dropped it. Without even explaining, I turned back to search, but in such a vast park, I didn't know where to begin. What's wrong? Chester caught up with me, his brow furrowed with concern. I briefly explained the situation and apologized to him. I'm sorry, Mr. Caldwell, but this bracelet is extremely important to me. It's the only thing my grandmother left me. Can we discuss the collaboration tomorrow? I need to search for the bracelet now. Chester didn't respond. He simply turned and walked away. I was taken aback, thinking he might be upset. However, at that moment, I couldn't worry about that. If I had truly lost the bracelet, I would live with regret for the rest of my life. I retraced our steps, searching along the path we had taken earlier. As I was circling half of the park, suddenly the park's loudspeaker crackled to life. To my surprise, it was Chester's voice that echoed through the park. If anyone has found a bracelet with jade beads, please bring it to the broadcast room. A substantial reward will be offered. After a brief pause, his voice resonated again through the speakers. As a token of gratitude, I will give a reward of £10,000 to whoever brings the bracelet to the broadcast room. £10,000? Good heavens! While the bracelet held immense sentimental value for me, in terms of monetary worth, it wasn't particularly valuable. If I were to sell it, it might fetch a few £100s at most. I stood stunned for a moment before resuming my search. Now, it wasn't just me looking, everyone around was bent over, searching for the bracelet. After all, £10,000 for finding a bracelet in the park was an excellent deal. Having searched the paths without success, I turned my attention to the pond. I rushed to the edge of the water, not bothering to look for a life ring. I waded straight in. The water wasn't particularly deep, reaching just to my chest, but visibility was poor. I had to bend down close to the water surface to see anything. However, after a long search, I still came up empty-handed. This city has distinct seasons, with significant temperature differences between day and night. By now, the pond was nearly deserted, and the water had cooled considerably. As I emerged, a gust of wind made me shiver. Chester was standing there, clutching a towel. Without a word, he wrapped it around me. He frowned, seeming displeased. Stop searching. But I've booked a room at the hotel in the park. Go have something to eat and rest. I'll help you search again tonight. I wanted to refuse, but seeing Chester's expression, I decided against it. I nodded, silently agreeing. When I woke up, the screen of my phone showed it was already 11 o'clock at night. After gathering my thoughts, worried about the bracelet, I quickly put on my shoes and left the room. On my way to the pond, I wondered if the area would still be open at night. If not, would I need to find a staff member? But as I approached, I saw warm yellow lights illuminating the water surface, and there was someone in the pond. It was a tall man wearing a black shirt, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and black shorts. His clothes were soaked through as he moved back and forth in the water, occasionally bending down to search beneath the surface. It was Chester. I stopped in my tracks, silently watching. The hardest part of my heart seemed to soften a bit. A gentle breeze blew past, and Chester happened to look up, our eyes meeting. He paused for a moment. I admit, at that moment, I was truly moved. I had never imagined that a scene straight out of a romantic drama would one day happen to me. I slowly walked over, wanting to say something, but when I opened my mouth, no words came out. Instead, it was Chester who rubbed his nose, looking apologetic. I'm sorry, I haven't found the bracelet yet. I shook my head, my heart stirred with 100 emotions, yet I couldn't find the words to express them. In the end, I merely whispered, "It's all right." I walked to the edge of the pool, noticing Chester's wet clothes, and quickly beckoned, "Come on out." One of his sleeves had fallen, which he casually rolled up. You know, I could have hired people to search, but for something so important to you, I felt it would be more meaningful if I found it myself, he said. As he spoke, Chester rubbed the tip of his nose, seemingly a nervous habit of his. You should go back to bed, Chester's voice rang out in the night, low and soft. If I can't find it, I'll hire people to help me. I promise I'll have it for you by morning. His tone was calm, but his expression was incredibly serious, looking at me as if making a solemn vow. I stood by the pool, silently watching him. The night stretched on, vast and lonely. Neither of us spoke, enveloped in silence. After a long while, I suddenly smiled and asked him with utmost sincerity, "Chester, you haven't actually fallen for me, have you?" I had asked him this before, but then it was mostly in jest. This time, however, I was serious. Chester was equally serious. He was taken aback for a moment, then collected himself. He rubbed his nose again before slowly speaking. "Yes," he said. Just a few steps away, he gazed intently into my eyes. "I've liked you for a long time." I couldn't help but laugh. "But we've only known each other for a few days." Chester chuckled too. He walked towards the shore and sat down by the pool. Inexplicably, I found myself walking over and sitting down next to him. My arm barely brushed against his clothes, yet he suddenly stood up and moved a few inches away. Seeing my confusion, he quickly explained, "I'm wet." "Ah, of course." The atmosphere grew quiet again. After a moment of silence, he suddenly picked up where we left off. "Do you think I'd make such a mess of myself for someone I've only known for a few days?" Chester seemed to realize his words were inappropriate and hastily added, "I've known you for a long time." "Known me for a long time?" I was puzzled but didn't speak, quietly waiting for Chester to continue. He looked into the distance, as if recalling something. However, before he could say anything, his face suddenly turned red. I watched as he became flushed all over, even his ears turning pink, and I couldn't help but find it amusing. Seeing me laugh, Chester seemed to grow more flustered. He quickly turned to look at me. "I observed you for a long time when you were at your previous company." Seeing my confused expression, Chester nodded and explained, "Your previous company was in the same business complex as mine." "And then?" I prompted. His face reddened even more as he continued. "And then, I noticed you for a long time." "Impossible!" I exclaimed. Chester's appearance was far too striking. If we had met many times, how could I possibly have no recollection of him? It seemed utterly impossible. However, Chester appeared to remember something. The blush on his face gradually faded, replaced by a furrowed brow. His voice lowered even further. "You were with someone else then. You wouldn't have noticed me." I was taken aback for a moment, but he wasn't wrong. I had been with a male colleague from my company at that time. Back then, I was madly infatuated with my ex-boyfriend. My ex was the typical pretty boy. He lived off me, sweet-talking me on the surface, but in reality, he was using my money to chase after other girls. In the end, I caught him red-handed, and he had the audacity to argue that it was because I wouldn't sleep with him. In a fit of rage, I slapped him twice and ran away before he could react. After that, I handed in my resignation and blocked all contact with him. To be honest, I really hadn't seen Chester when I was at my previous company. Logically, such a striking man would have left an impression, even if just glimpsed in passing. But I had absolutely no recollection of him. Then, Chester told me about some things I didn't know. For instance, as the CEO of a company, Chester had apparently fallen for a girl from the same building at first sight. There was no particular reason, just that the girl always liked to use his car as a mirror, striking various silly and cute poses, occasionally showing off her alluring figure. Well, that was indeed me. I recalled when I was working at my previous job, driving the old car my family had given me. I'd discovered that my favorite corner of the car park always had a Bentley parked there, and I parked next to it every time I went. The car's windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside. I had seen it parked there for a long time and always assumed it was some boss's old car that wasn't being used. Who would have thought there was someone sitting inside every day? I tried hard to remember what I had done in front of that car, and the more I thought about it, the more alarmed I became. Because I usually arrived quite early, and the parking spot was in a corner, there was almost never anyone around, so I tended to be quite uninhibited. I had applied lipstick using the car windows and rearview mirror, picked my teeth, and even popped pimples. I had even taken selfies using the car as a backdrop, using the windows as mirrors, and frequently turned around to check out my curvy figure. The more I thought about it, the more mortified I felt. Taking a deep breath, I couldn't bear to stay seated any longer. I hastily stood up, intending to escape first and deal with the rest later. However, as soon as I rose, my wrist was grasped. It was Chester. He looked down at me, his expression serious and focused. I snuck a glance at him. Sure enough, the tips of his ears were tinged with pink. He gazed at me silently, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. His anxious demeanor was actually quite endearing. Judging by his expression, he seemed to have something he wanted to say to me. I thought it might be something along the lines of "Will you be with me?" But then, his grip on my wrist tightened slightly, and he suddenly said, "Brace yourself." For what? I asked. But he didn't answer my question directly. I can't hold back anymore. I was about to ask what he couldn't hold back when he suddenly raised his hand, gently cupping my chin with one hand. His fingertips were cool from the pool water and trembling slightly. The next moment, he covered my eyes with his other hand, and as my vision went dark, I felt a soft pressure on my lips. My heart began to race wildly. A soft warmth pressed against my lips, the sensation so exquisite it made me tremble. Just as I hesitated whether to push him away, I suddenly felt his tongue gently parting my lips. In an instant, I was completely captivated. All my thoughts were consumed by him. I almost forgot to react, my hands tightly clutching the edge of his shirt, my heartbeat thunderous. Everything stopped the moment the kiss ended. He finally released me, slowly straightening up, the blush on his ears seeming to deepen. Chester looked down at me, his gaze deep and focused. "Virginia, let's be together," he said softly. "What do you say?" Of course, I wanted to say yes. I beckoned him closer with my finger. "Come here, I'll tell you a secret." At that moment, we were sitting by the edge of the pool, the moonlight shimmering on the water, warm yellow lights glowing above us. The poolside was deserted, just the two of us there. Chester paused for a few seconds, then leaned in closer. "What secret?" he asked in a low voice, seemingly struggling to maintain his composure as he licked his lips. I smiled. "Actually, when I saw you searching for my bracelet in the water earlier, I wanted to kiss you then." The sentence wasn't long, but it seemed to take Chester a moment to process. He was stunned for a few seconds before he came to his senses, a light suddenly igniting in his dark eyes. I closed my eyes and kissed him, mimicking what he had done earlier. After this brief, tentative kiss, I boldly leaned against his shoulder and softly asked, "Why are you such a coward?" He turned his head to look at me. "Am I allowed to object?" "No." "All right then." Chester smiled resignedly. When you meet someone so special, it's natural to feel a bit timid. His use of the word timid made me laugh, and I nodded in agreement. True, a girl like me who's good-looking, curvy, and outgoing is quite special indeed. I was actually joking, even saying the opposite of what I meant. But Chester took it very seriously. He nodded and then gave a soft chuckle. "Yes, that's why I never imagined you'd want to be with me." I was taken aback. "Are you serious?" He nodded. I fell silent for a few seconds, feeling somewhat moved. It seemed that no matter how outstanding a person might be, they could still feel insecure in front of the one they loved. A cold breeze swept past, and I leaned against Chester's shoulder, shivering involuntarily. "Let's go back to the room, it's cold at night," Chester said, reaching out his hand towards me. After a moment's hesitation, he wrapped his arm around my shoulders, drawing me into his embrace. I nodded but couldn't help glancing at the water one last time. To say I wasn't disappointed would be a lie, it was the only keepsake my grandmother had left me. But I could come to terms with it. Perhaps this bracelet was meant to bring Chester and me together. Maybe it was my grandmother's spirit from above that had match-made us. I comforted myself with these thoughts as Chester escorted me back to the hotel. At my door, he released his hold and pointed to the room next door. "I'm staying next door. If you need anything, just knock." In the dead of night, Chester was playing the perfect gentleman, showing no intention of entering my room. I couldn't resist leaning in closer, my fingertips tracing circles on his shirt buttons. "Would you like to come in with me, Mr. Caldwell?" A moment ago, Chester had been the epitome of a successful businessman, his demeanor reminiscent of a CEO from a romantic drama. But in an instant, his expression froze. Amused by his reaction, I deliberately teased him further, moving even closer and whispering in his ear. "My bed is particularly soft, you know." He remained silent for a few seconds, then gently pushed my hand away and turned to enter his own room. His parting words were, "Call me if you need anything." As the door closed, I couldn't stop laughing, my mind filled with the image of his reddened ears as he left. I was nearly asleep when my phone suddenly vibrated. It was Chester. He said, "Let me share a secret with you too." My curiosity piqued. I quickly replied, "Go on." Chester's message came through swiftly, just 2 short sentences, but they made me blush instantly. He wrote, "Actually, I had a nosebleed in the car that time. When you wore that low-cut top." Thinking back to my actions then, I felt so embarrassed I could dig a hole with my toes. However, embarrassed as I was, I still managed a cheeky retort. "Frequent nosebleeds might mean you're not getting enough vitamins. Shall I buy you some supplements?" Chester replied quickly, "No need, you can test it yourself." Despite the banter, I slept soundly that night, clutching my phone. I suppose when you're in love, even your dreams are tinged with pink. The next morning, I was awakened by a knock at the door. I stumbled out of bed and opened it, only to be greeted by an incredibly handsome face. It was Chester. I stared at him for a few seconds, then suddenly came to my senses and instinctively tried to close the door, but he blocked it with his hand. Pushing the door open, Chester leaned against the doorframe, his gaze sweeping over me, a smile playing on his lips. "No need to hide. You look cute like this." "Really?" I asked, somewhat skeptically. I had just woken up, and due to the sudden nature of our stay, I was still wearing yesterday's clothes, now all wrinkled. My hair was undoubtedly a mess, and I hadn't brushed my teeth or washed my face. But Chester's expression was so sincere that I couldn't doubt him. "Give me your hand," Chester said softly as he approached me. Confused but compliant, I held out my hand. The next moment, a familiar bracelet appeared on my wrist. I stared at the bracelet in shock, completely caught off guard. Wasn't the bracelet lost? Chester smiled at me and said quietly, "I hired someone to find it. It cost a bit." I gazed at the bracelet on my wrist, lost in thought for a moment, then nodded without speaking. But when Chester's fingers had touched my wrist earlier, they had been ice cold. This liar. It was only then that I noticed Chester was holding a bag. Seeing me look at it, he handed it to me. "I bought you some clothes. Go change." I took the clothes, but noticed that Chester showed no signs of leaving. Raising an eyebrow, I looked up at him and struck what I considered to be a seductive pose. "What's this, Mr. Caldwell? Not leaving? Perhaps you'd like to stay and enjoy the show?" For some reason, after looking me up and down, Chester didn't blush this time. Instead, he smiled. "I'll wait for you outside." With that, he left the room, closing the door behind him. I put the clothes on a chair, intending to freshen up in the bathroom first, but froze when I caught sight of myself in the mirror. The woman in the mirror had ridiculously messy hair, her fringe sticking up in a V-shape, sleep in the corners of her eyes, slight facial puffiness, and an oily morning sheen on her skin. Not a single flaw had been missed. No wonder Chester hadn't blushed earlier, but instead had given me that amused look. Looking in the mirror, I recalled Chester's earnest expression when he complimented me on looking cute. What a big liar! After freshening up, I sheepishly left the room. This time, there was an additional person in the hallway. Monty. Seeing me, he bounced over and hugged my legs, calling out in his sweet, loud voice, "Auntie." This time, it was my turn to blush. After being called that so many times by the little one, I was now actually going to be his aunt. Perhaps out of excitement, during breakfast, the little guy clung to my leg and chattered away, revealing many secrets. For instance, he had seen my photo long ago. I was quite surprised and looked up at Chester, only to see him uncomfortably turn his head away. Monty, however, directly picked up Chester's phone from the table, lit up the screen, and held it in front of me. "This is the photo he secretly took of you." I looked down, and my blood pressure instantly skyrocketed. Good grief, it was a picture of me taking a selfie with that luxury car. I hadn't realized Chester had taken a photo from inside the car. Monty said that after countless times of Chester showing him my photo and asking if his future aunt was pretty, he clearly remembered the face in the picture. In fact, our meeting on the street that day was a coincidence. Chester was in a cafe buying coffee for Monty when the boy saw me through the glass door and ran out on his own. All to find a wife for his uncle. The clever little rascal had hugged my leg and called me Mum, pretending to have mistaken me for someone else, hoping to establish a connection to play matchmaker. Unexpectedly, my response was explosive, immediately telling him to call me Auntie, which he was more than happy to go along with. It was his uncle who had chickened out. At this point in the story, Monty gave Chester a look of disappointment, shaking his head and sighing deeply. Utterly useless, really. Amidst Monty's chatter, breakfast came to an end. However, just as we were about to leave, Monty was suddenly sent off by Chester to buy drinks. I offered to go instead, but Chester held me back. He opened his wallet and casually pulled out two 20-pound notes, handing them to Monty. Off you go. Monty took the money and bounced away. I was a bit confused and was about to ask him when Chester suddenly stood up. Then, he walked around the table and sat down beside me. The somewhat familiar scent suddenly surrounded me, making me a bit nervous. He chuckled softly, his ears no longer red. He placed one hand on the wall behind me, leaned in, and whispered in my ear. I've wanted to kiss you for a long time. With that, he turned his head and pressed his lips to mine. But, the kiss only lasted 2 seconds before it was interrupted by a sudden burst of laughter from behind. We both turned to look and saw Monty standing up from behind the sofa. Haha, Uncle, you're so cheesy. He turned to look at me, his face full of disbelief. Isn't he cheesy? I nodded sincerely, about to add my confirmation when Chester suddenly cupped my chin. The words I was about to say were all kissed back. From the corner of my eye, I saw Chester reach out with one hand to block Monty's view. Then, with his other hand still holding my chin, he deepened the kiss in the corner of the restaurant. He murmured against my lips, his voice muffled. It's too late to regret it now. I kept my eyes open, seeing my own reflection in his eyes so close to mine. I smiled, then reached out a hand to cover Monty's eyes as he tried to peek. It was indeed too late. But Chester, cheesy as he was still so handsome.